Hello. We are talking today about the role of emotions in economic decisions and the relationship between emotions and rationality. This meeting is part of a series of forums that we organize in 9 European cities and that have women, neuroscientists, philosophers, and psychologists talk about the subject of emotions. Why emotions? Because emotions till not many years ago was considered a deteriorating quality for women. Women could not be philosophers, could not have high rational thinking because they were supposed to be victims of their emotions. And they could not be elected, they could not vote. Women were considered, you could not rely on them, not reliable, because they would change too much their ideas and feelings driven by their emotions. Recently, in the last 30 years, it was found that emotions, at the contrary, are very important in rational decisions. Actually, there cannot be rational decisions without emotions. And this theme has become very big and interesting. And I think that to face the challenges of the new millennium, emotional intelligence is very important, not only for women, but for men as well. I will stop here because we have 3 great speakers. The first one is Elisabetta Phelps. She is a Pershing Square Professor of Human Neuroscience at Harvard University, a real star in her field. She has been the recipient of the 21st Century Science Award from the St. James MacDonald Foundation, Distinguished Scholar Award from the Social Affective Neurosciences Societies, and the William James Award for the Association for Psychological Science. She's a fellow of American Association of Advancements of Science, and among all the many recognitions she had, she has served as president of the Society for Neuroeconomics, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Social Affective Neuroscience Society. And she will talk about the loss and economic decisions insight from a neuroscience of emotions. Welcome, Elisabetta, and thank you for being with us from so far away.
So I'm going to talk today about loss and economic decisions and what we can learn from the neuroscience of emotion. And when we think about emotion and decision making, one of the ways we've typically thought about this is that there are sort of decisions you make with reason and decisions you make with emotion. And this sort of dichotomy, this notion that there are 2 systems, is not really aligned with what we know from neuroscience and emotion. So what insights from neuroscience and emotion can inform our understanding of emotion decision making? Well, we know that the brain systems of emotion and cognition are intermixed, intertwined from early perception to complex reasoning. And there are not separate brain systems for emotion and reason. And that different aspects of emotion, such as the feelings you have, the mood you might be in, whether you're stressed or not, did the choice elicit arousal in you, these have unique and specific effects on different cognitive functions, including decision making. So today I want to talk about what we can learn from the neuroscience of emotion about 2 different behaviors. First, auction behaviors and economic decisions that are risky. I'm going to start with an example from auctions. So I don't know if any of you know the artist Banksy, but Banksy had this work that has received a lot of attention in the art world. I'm going to play you a short video about this work. So here we go.
Shredding this Banksy painting couldn't devalue it. In fact, it just fetched the artist's highest selling price yet, $25.4 million. Back in 2018, Banksy's Girl with Balloon was shredded during a live auction at Sotheby's just after the gavel came down, selling it for $1.4 million. It was a stunt years in the making as the anonymous artist built a shredder into the frame and waited for the perfect time to activate it. After that, the painting was renamed Love is in the Bin, and it was sent on a world tour so Banksy fans could get a glimpse at it for themselves. When Sotheby's announced it was hitting the auction block again this year, they estimated it would sell for up to $8.3 million. It ended up going for 3 times that amount. When will the art world learn? Never underestimate Banksy.
So if you ask the question, what is a Banksy worth? In 2018, this particular piece was worth 1.4 million US dollars, but the pre-auction estimate for that was only about $250,000 US dollars. In 2021, it went for 25.4 million US dollars, but the pre-auction estimate was only about 8.3 million US dollars. So one question is, why so much? And also, how could the Sotheby's pre-auction value estimates be so wrong? So it's well known in economics that one of the things that happens with auctions is people tend to overbid. And I will say this is not just about Banksy paintings and art. This is, there's a website called eBay where you can engage in online auctions. eBay has had gift certificates for eBay. So if you look here, what you'll see is gift certificates for eBay that are $50 are going for $51. So it's not just the art world that overbids in economic auctions. It's a tendency humans have. So why do auctions lead to overbidding? Well, there's really 2 hypotheses emerging from economics. The first is that there's a joy of winning an economic auction, and this joy gets added to the value of the thing that you're bidding for. The second theory is that people are averse to risk, so they bid more so they don't risk possibly losing the thing they're bidding on. So I want to ask the question, does neuroscience favor one theory over another? So to do this, we looked at a brain region called the striatum. So I'll just give you a little primer on the striatum. The striatum is here in green. It codes subjective value. It responds to all types of rewards. It responds to monetary rewards, cooperation, drugs, beauty, and it should also respond to the joy of winning, social rewards. So if you have a benefit from the joy of winning, you might see a boost in signal in the striatum when you win an economic auction. To investigate this, we did an economic auction for The Economist. This is a first price sealed bid auction, so we can know what the Nash equilibrium bid should be. And the way it worked is there were 2 conditions. You either played an auction with a partner that you met beforehand, and this is actually Andy Shatter, he's an economist at NYU, who was my collaborator on this project, or you played a lottery. And the lottery was simply the number your auction bid was assigned to you, and you either played or you didn't play, and you won or you didn't win. We put people in an MRI scanner, and we had them play these 2 conditions over and over, and we looked at brain signal in the striatum. So what do we see? So here's the striatum, and what you can see is when we just compare when you won money versus didn't, we see a response in the striatum as you would expect, given that it codes subjective value. And here I'm plotting the lottery condition, and what you see is an increase in response when individuals win the lottery, they just won money, but you see no difference when they lost. Now, if you lost money, you would see a decrease in response in the striatum. But here they didn't really lose anything, right? They just didn't win the lottery. So this makes sense. What about in the auction? Did we see that extra boost in the win signal when they won the auction? We did not. Instead, we saw a large response to losing. So much like in the lottery, when they didn't win the auction, they didn't lose anything, they just didn't win anything. But nevertheless, it looks in this striatum like they actually lost something. In this case, the social competition of the auction. So we showed greater striatal activation, I should say decreased striatal activation to loss relative to gains, and this is inconsistent with the joy of winning hypothesis. And then we looked at the signal in the striatum and we said, when can it predict what you bid on an auction? And we found striatal activation to losses, but not gains, correlated with how much you bid in that auction. So this suggests to us that fear of losing, not joy of winning, may actually be driving overbidding. To investigate this further, we then did a psychological study, a behavioral economics study, where participants bid, they did the same sort of first price sealed bid auction, but they had two conditions. They were either, the one we called the loss frame, they came in, they were given $15, and they were told, you have to return this $15 if you lose the auction. The other group had what we called a gain frame. They were told, if you win the auction, you're going to get a $15 bonus. So I just want to point out the monetary risk is equivalent in these two auctions. So what did we find? We found that emphasizing the loss increases overbidding and leads to a higher profit for a hypothetical auctioneer. And this suggests to us that loss aversion, or perhaps the threat of loss, may lead to paying too much in auctions. So we then wanted to say, well, what do we know about loss in the brain and the threat of loss? So we asked the question, does monetary loss look like threat in the brain and the body? And what does threat look like in the brain and the body? In the brain, we would expect to see responses in the amygdala. This is the brain's threat detector. It's a brain region that tells you there's something out there that's dangerous for you. In the body, when you experience a threat, you become aroused. You have the fight or flight response. We can measure this in the laboratory by putting little electrodes on your fingers and trying to see, do you sweat a little bit more? And this gives us a sense of your fight or flight reaction to a stimulus. So to see if monetary loss looks like threat in the brain and body, we gave people a series of choices. The choices either looked like this. You could either make a choice of, you had a 50-50 chance of either winning a large sum of money or losing some money, or getting nothing, so you could choose either option. Or we had choices that looked like this. 50-50 chance where you could, one choice was to win some money versus get nothing, and the other choice was to take a sure amount. By combining choices like this over a series of trials, we could estimate two parameters. We could estimate lambda, which is your loss aversion, and rho, which is your sensitivity to risk or your risk attitude. Now, I'll tell you right now, we didn't see any relationship between threat responses in the brain and body and risk attitude. So I'm going to focus here on loss aversion. So what do we see? Well, here is lambda for individuals, loss aversion coefficients. People vary in how loss averse they are. In general, people tend to be averse to losses in economic decisions, but here in our participants, we saw some individuals were loss averse, some individuals were sort of gain-loss neutral, some were gain-seeking. If lambda equals 1, that means you're gain-loss neutral. But we did see that how aroused you are to losses correlates with your loss aversion. So individuals who showed more of a sweat reaction to losses relative to gains showed greater loss aversion. We also, when we looked in the brain, we saw, again, this striatum code subjective value that includes your risk attitudes, but the amygdala codes loss aversion. So the amount of amygdala response you see to losses correlates with your loss aversion. So this suggests to us that monetary loss looks like threat in the brain and the body, that your threat reactions to loss predict loss aversion, that your over-arousal to losses relative to gain correlates with loss aversion, and that activation of the amygdala to losses relative to gains also correlates with loss aversion. So then we ask the question, well, if arousal is really driving loss aversion, can I change your emotional response? Can I change your arousal and change your choice? So we did this first by asking the question, can we reduce loss aversion by pharmacologically reducing arousal? And we did this by administering a drug called propranolol. Propranolol is a beta-adrenergic receptor antagonist, a beta blocker, and then it crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's given for high blood pressure. It's not used as much these days as it used to be because it crosses the blood-brain barrier, so it impacts the brain as well. But importantly with propranolol, it blunts arousal responses in the body and its neurochemical impact in the brain without sedative effects. So we asked the question, would propranolol reduce loss aversion? Participants came into the laboratory. They were given either propranolol or a placebo. They then did a series of gambles like the ones you already saw, and for each we estimated lambda and rho, loss aversion and risk sensitivity. They came back about a week later. They were given whichever one they weren't given before, placebo or propranolol, did a series of gambles. We estimated lambda or rho. And I should say, when we asked participants after the fact, did you know if you took the placebo or propranolol, they guessed about 47% correct. So in other words, they had no idea. So can we reduce loss aversion by pharmacologically reducing arousal? Yes. Propranolol reduces loss aversion. It had no impact on risk attitudes. Now this is interesting, right? It provides some experimental proof that it is arousal that is driving your loss aversion, your sensitivity to loss in economic decisions. It's not a very practical means if, say, you wanted to go out into the world and make sure that you are not too loss averse in, say, an auction or a stock trade. So is there a more practical means to reduce arousal and change choices? So here we looked at the research in psychotherapy. If you were to have an anxiety disorder, you might go to a clinician, and one of the things they might do is engage you in cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the things cognitive behavioral therapy does is it does cognitive restructuring. It teaches you that you can have a way of thinking about things that either increases your emotional response or actually decreases your emotional response. And you would see cartoons like this of two cats that have very different attitudes about a dog just by how they interpret that dog. And so emotion regulation, you can be taught to reevaluate or reappraise a stimulus to alter your emotional response. And it's been shown to reduce arousal and the amygdala response to threats. So how might this play out in an economic decision? So what we did in this task was we asked people to make the same type of gambles you just saw under two conditions. We gave them an instruction to either attend to the choice that they're making. So focus on just one choice only, this choice in isolation, don't think about the other choices. And under that condition, we estimated loss aversion and risk sensitivity. In the other condition, we said, okay, this time, I want you to think like a trader. Imagine that you're assembling a portfolio of choices. Only one of these choices is going to be paid out at the end, but you're going to think about the choices as a whole. It's one of many choices that you will make. And again, we can estimate lambda and rho. So when we did this, again, these are the individuals and their loss aversion coefficients. Now I'm going to show you how much did they decrease loss aversion. These are the same individuals in the same order. And what we find is that for almost all individuals, regardless of how loss averse they were to start, using a regulation strategy decreased their loss aversion. We also saw that using an emotion regulation strategy decreased the over-arousal to losses relative to gains. You see that on the left-hand side, where in the attend condition, you see greater arousal to losses relative to gains, where in the regulate condition, you see a slightly less arousal to losses relative to gains. It also decreased amygdala activation, as you see on the right. So that's not very, so how might this play out in the real world? So interestingly, there was a study in 2002 published by Andrew Lowe at MIT. And what he did was he took traders on a trading floor. He connected them to devices to measure their physiological arousal response. And he looked at the relationship between physiological arousal and their trading performance, and particularly how they responded to real-life market events. And what he found was that physiological arousal was attenuated in experienced and high-performing traders, individuals who did better in the stock world. And he hypothesized that is because some individuals are actually inclined to not show overreactions to market events, and that makes them better traders. He hypothesized that people were born this way. An alternative hypothesis is that they actually learn to regulate. They use something like the type of emotion regulation strategy you might learn from a therapist to control their reactions to market events, thus not responding to losses so much and performing better in the long run. So I suggested to you today that we have a typical way of viewing the relationship between emotion and reason as two separate ways we can make choices, sort of two different systems we can use for making decisions. But when we think about the neuroscience of emotion, we see that there's really a much more nuanced and complicated relationship between emotion and decision making and emotion and reason. I've told you that monetary or social loss looks like threat in the brain and the body. And this is true whether you're doing auction bidding or you're making risky choices. And that techniques that we typically use to reduce threat reactions can be adapted to reduce the unwanted impact of loss aversion in economic decisions. So before I conclude, I just want to thank my collaborators on these projects, Andy Schotter, who I already introduced you to, and Mauricio Delgado were part of the auction studies, and Colin Kammerer, a behavioral economist at Caltech, and Peter Sokol-Hessner oversaw the risky choice studies. And finally, I want to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you.
I had a question.
Yes, please.
One is, I was thinking about Madoff, you know?
Oh, yes.
People investing with Madoff. Was that somehow connected to risk aversion? Because Madoff promised that there would be no loss.
Yes.
And a very high, and you wonder why people who were so expert in investing would be, you know, investing with Madoff when it was clear that it was not possible.
I'm sure, you know, loss aversion was part of it. But also, you know, there was a social trust, right, with him. So I think there's another emotional aspect that came into place, right, with Madoff. It was you know, people trusted him, people knew him. He was very much, you know, in the Jewish community, he was very much a leading figure. And so I think both of those things came into play. One, he suggested they would reduce loss, but also make great profit. Two, they also had this connection, another emotional reaction, a social reaction that I think led to more trust.
And then the other question is gamblers.
Yes.
Gamblers seem not to care about loss.
That's not true. So gamblers will double down, right? Once they lose, they don't want to walk away, right? So I think it is the case. You know, they may take a lot of risk, but one of the things where the gambler gets in trouble, is when they're trying to make back their losses, right? They keep going, even though they're losing, right? So I don't think it's necessarily the case that gamblers don't care about it. They may tolerate risk more, but I think they're also, at least the ones that don't make money at it are also loss aversion.
Would be a good therapy for them.
There's a lot of good therapies for them, but that would be one of them, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Elisabetta. I now would like to invite to the podium Maya Hillel. Here are my papers because it's very hard for me to explain in English all the great achievement of my speakers. I'm Italian, but Maya Hillel is from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Department of Psychology and the Federal Center for Study of Rationality. She received many awards in her life, among which the Rothschild Prize, a highly prestigious Israeli in the sciences, and she is really a star in psychology. In this session, we have a neuroscientist, a psychologist, and a philosopher. So we approach the discussion of economic decision from different points of view, all pertaining to the brain. Maya Hillel is known for her work of inaccuracies in human reasoning about probability. She also studied decision theory in connection with Newton paradox, investigated how gender stereotyping can block human problem solving, and this is very interesting for me because I deal a lot with gender differences, especially in emotion. And also, she was part of the team to debunk the Bible code. studied rationality in the Hebrew University, and I'm very pleased to have her here. She will talk about behavioral economics versus classical economics and if they need a reconciliation. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Viviana. So we will begin with a short video, which is a tribute to where we are.
One of Aristotle's most famous contributions to science is actually based upon a false claim. For years, Aristotle preached that heavy objects fall faster than lighter objects, stating that the speed at which something falls actually depends on its weight. He would explain it to anyone that would listen. His example was that an object 10 times heavier than another would have to fall 10 times faster. No one disagreed with Aristotle. Most people were comfortable with the idea of heavy objects falling faster because it's what they were used to seeing. For almost 2,000 years, Aristotle's rules for falling objects remained unchallenged until a new scientist attempted to prove him wrong. In the year 1589, an Italian scientist named Galileo attempted to prove Aristotle wrong. Galileo believed the only reason heavy objects fall faster is because air resistance slows down lighter objects, and that if air resistance could be reduced, they would both fall at the same speed. In order to prove his point, he gathered everyone in the city, climbed to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and explained that the only way to prove who was right for sure was to perform a scientific experiment. Galileo's experiment went like this. He stood at the top of the Leaning Tower and held out a cannonball and a wooden ball of the same size. The only difference between the two objects was their weight. Galileo explained that since they are the same size and shape, they would feel the same amount of air resistance as they fell. His conclusion was that they should hit the ground at the same time. So he leaned out over the edge, dropped both objects, and a little more than 3 seconds later, everyone in the city of Pisa saw the cannonball and the wooden ball land at the same time, proving once and for all that if there is no air resistance, all objects, no matter how heavy, will fall at the same rate.
So to sum up this kind of poor video, Aristotle believed that heavy objects fall faster than light objects. His intuition, shared by many to this day, held up for 2,000 years. Galileo proposed an experimental method, and he dropped two balls of the same shape but different weight, and everybody saw that they fell at the same time. And we now know that free fall speed is not dependent on mass. And I will, of course, explain what this video has to do with the topic of my talk, but I will get to it at the end. So the field known as behavioral economics was born when Richard Thaler, an economist, met Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist, at the second half of the 1970s. They are widely regarded as the founding fathers of behavioral economics and have 2 Nobel Prizes in economic science to attest for it. But in the lay public and in the media, behavioral economics is often confused with psychology, and I get called a behavioral economist a lot, but I am a psychologist, not an economist, and therefore I don't call myself a behavioral economist. Not that any of this really matters much. Behavioral economics is doing economics with the realization that human economic agents are human, made of flesh and blood, and subject to all the foibles and weaknesses of flesh and blood, and just doing economics with that in mind makes it behavioral economics. Now, historically speaking, the early giants of economic thought explicitly acknowledged that certain kinds of economics relied on psychology. We can have the next slide now. They even formulated some of the specific insights that were later rediscovered by experimentalists, and you can look at the slide. I will go on. I will not read it for you. Now, psychology has always been embraced by neoclassical economics. Indeed, the very core concept of utility acknowledges psychology in two ways. First, utility, that variable which economic agents want to maximize in their choices, is not necessarily linear with the variables on which it is defined. Indeed, if this is money and this is utility, then the relationship between the sensation, the objective value of money and what it does for you in terms of utility, it looks like this in economics, and this is a typical psychophysical function. Psychophysical function is, of course, psychology. The second sense in which utility acknowledges psychology is that utility acknowledges individual differences. It's not a one-size-fits-all function, but rather different people have different tastes, different preferences, different abilities, different beliefs, different expectations, all of which has always been recognized by mainstream economics. But in spite of acknowledging all of these individual differences, there is one variable that economic theory has always insisted is shared by all economic agents, and that is rationality. Now, what is rationality? There is the technical sense, and there is the everyday sense. We can have the next slide now. In the technical sense, rationality is first and foremost consistency. First of all, your preferences have to be consistent with each other, such that, for example, if you prefer A to B and B to C, by consistency, you should prefer A to C. Second, to be rational, you have to always be rational. It is not the case that to be irrational, you have to always be irrational. Think of an attribute like honesty. To be an honest person, you have to always be honest. To be a dishonest person, you don't have always to be dishonest. It's enough that you are sometimes dishonest. So rationality requires two kinds of consistency. Consistency of your preferences and consistency over time and situations in this being consistent. And now another psychological insight that was readily embraced by neoclassical economics, and indeed also won a Nobel Prize in economic sciences for the person who put it forth, is that of Herb Simon, a Renaissance man whose work influenced not only psychology, but economics, computer science, political science, and much more. And Simon pointed out that people couldn't possibly be as rational as required by economic theory because human beings are limited beings, or what he called bounded beings. They have limited time, limited memory, limited cognitive capabilities, limited energy, sometimes even limited motivation. So he introduced the notion of bounded rationality and said that people do not necessarily optimize, in other words, do the best, but rather they satisfy, in other words, do something that is good enough. But within the limitations that Simon pointed out, people were still required by his theory to be rational, to be consistent. In other words, boundedness is no excuse for being capricious. Now, many other psychological insights have found their way over the years into mainstream economics, but the standard way that this would unfold is as follows. Somebody would point out, and in the good cases with experimental backup, a counterexample to one of the axioms, and an economist would say, well, in that case, let me introduce that finding, that variable, into my mathematical model, which is the favorite way of doing theoretical economics. And as long as they could model it, they were perfectly willing to embrace it. For example, take the finding that people are myopic, that their ability to look ahead, plan ahead, and know how they are going to feel ahead in the future can be quite readily embraced in a standard theory, because economists have always known that time is money, and they have no problem handling the fact that utility gets discounted over time. Now, in the 1940s, von Neumann and Morgenstern offered a mathematical axiomatization of utility theory under risk. And they lay down a small number of prima facie natural and self-evident requirements of consistency, such as the transitivity requirement I mentioned earlier. They proved that if a person were consistent in the sense required by these axioms, then one could fit a utility function to that person's preferences, and choice would always be maximization of that utility. Now, the axioms, I will not go through them now, but first and foremost, the axiom required the individual to order the certain outcomes from best to worst. Now, take, for example, because it's the prototypical example, take money. We can certainly, it certainly seems natural to order money by monetary size from best to worst, but I can show you immediately that even that you can find a counterexample to. Take something as simple as comparing $1 million to $2 million. What would you rather have? You know, unless you're a philosopher or doing other kinds of being very clever, it's apparent that the answer is $2 million is better than $1 million. Now let me enrich the scenario. Suppose that yesterday you were worth $500,000, and today, lo and behold, thanks to the market, you're worth $1 million. Compare that to yesterday you were worth $4 million, and due to the market today you're worth $2 million. Which person would you rather be? The one with $1 million or the one with $2 million? I'm not sure that everybody would say in this case $1 million, but there is experimental evidence that lots of people say in this case, I'd rather be the first person. In other words, it turns out that it doesn't just matter how much you have, it matters how you got there. Now that's called path dependence, and path dependence violates an assumption of economic theory, a common assumption that claims that it should be independent of path. It doesn't matter how you got there, it matters what the final position is. So I would like to give you let me say the following. So until prospect theory, which I will say a word about in a minute for those who may not know what it is, the common exchange between psychologists or experimentalists and economists was that psychologists would point out some violation of the axiom, and economists would counter it as best they can or even embrace it into their theories, done on a piecemeal basis. And one of the most famous exchanges of this kind was done between Allais and Savage in one of the early conferences on utility theory, and I will give you a simplified version of their exchange. So I'm going to ask you a question, which when I have an audience large enough, I collect data on, because it's one of those things you can rely on to always replicate, but the audience here is too small, so each one of you will just have to ask himself or theirself what their preference is. What do you prefer? $700 for sure, right now, payable in cash, or an 80% chance for $1,000. Think about it. And if you're like the majority of subjects, you'd rather have the $700 than the gamble. Second question, what do you prefer? A $700 with a probability of 25%, 1 in 4, or $1,000 with a probability of 20%, 1 in 5. Think about it. And again, as I tell my students, it's not about whether I'm going to cheat with the probabilities. Bring your lawyer, bring your own chance device. I mean, check that I have the money. Nothing here should be about that. Again, if you're like a majority of the subjects, you prefer $1,000 with a 1 in 5 chance than $700 with a 1 in 4 chance. So did Savage. This was Allais' example, and Savage answered as most subjects do. Now, Allais pointed out that this violates utility theory, that this is inconsistent. Now, how can Savage do something inconsistent? I will now reframe the second choice problem for you. You have a 25% chance to face the following choice. The choice being what I asked you first. So it's now a two-step move. First of all, participate in a 1 in 4 lottery. You lost it, bye-bye. You won, you are now in a position that you can answer the question, would you rather have $700 for sure or $1,000 with an 80% probability? Now, again, most people say, you already asked me that question, and I already gave you the answer. I'd rather have $700 for sure than $1,000 with a probability of 80%. But notice that the question, in fact, is question number 2. It's not $700 for sure. It's $700 for sure if you pass a 1 in 4 lottery. So if you choose $700, it's a 1 in 4 chance of getting $700. Now, Savage went home, according to the legend around this story, thought about it, came back and said, indeed I erred. Indeed, the preferences I gave you are not my true preferences. I will think about it carefully, which of these two things I prefer, the gamble or the sure thing. But once I know, I'm going to give the same answer to both questions. Now, he may have thought his way out of the trap that Ale set for him, but he in fact gives thereby an example of a different kind of setup, if you will, and that is the one that says frames matter. In other words, how you think of a problem, how it's presented, the words, the terms make a difference. Now, there is no axiom in economic theory that says frames don't matter, because there's, as philosophers of science point out often, not everything in the theory is explicitly stated. Some things are too obvious to be stated. And one of the things that economic theory doesn't even think is worth mentioning explicitly is invariance to frame. Economic theory says that people choose between options. Psychology says that people choose between descriptions of options or presentations of options in the case it's not a verbal question. So how something is presented may affect choice even though the options themselves haven't changed. One of the most famous examples of this kind, you may have heard about it, goes as following. It's called the Asian disease story, but I've been told that Asian disease is no longer politically correct, so forget Asian disease. It's a flu. So a flu is expected next winter, and deaths are expected to run at 900. And you are prime minister, and what do you do about this dire prediction? Your health minister offers you a choice between 2 programs which you can adopt. If one is adopted, it's a certainty that 600 lives will be saved. One way to think about, the story doesn't tell you how a scenario like that would come about. That's the beauty of hypothetical questionnaires. You can just invent whatever you want, but you may think of the existence of some kind of foolproof cure that you only have enough to administer to 600 people. So if you use it, 600 people will be saved. The other one is uncertain. The other one, you have enough to give everybody, but there's only a 2/3 probability that it will work. So with a 2/3 probability, you save everybody. With a 1/3 probability, you save nobody, and that is now your choice as prime minister. Again, it turns out from empirical evidence that when the story is told this way, most people prefer to save 600 lives than to take the gamble. But now you turn it around and you ask preferably different people so that they won't notice explicitly the move I'm going to make now. Instead of saying that the first program will save 600 lives, it says that the first program will result in the death of 300 people. Now, if you do nothing and it's 900, and you do program A and it's 300, you've just saved 600 people, but that you don't say it in so many words. You say 300 will die. And the second program, you say, with a 2/3 probability, nobody will die, and with a 1/3 probability, everybody will die. Everybody from what? Everybody from the projected 900. And now, lo and behold, as is known already from prospect theory, now people prefer the gamble to the sure thing. Now, surely preference can't be reliant on the words chosen to present the outcomes, but rather on the outcomes themselves. However, psychology shows that this sure thing is not a sure thing. In fact, since I knew Tversky personally, he was a friend and he was my mentor and he was my PhD advisor, I remember him once saying to me, any axiom that an economist will put forth, I can put forth an empirical counterexample, especially if I'm allowed, as I am, to vary frames. So you can't get people to be consistent if they respond to the way you present outcomes, and I can choose how I want to present them. Now, prospect theory, which I will not go into now for those who don't know, but it was what won Kahneman. Tversky was dead by then, the Nobel Prize in Economics, was revolutionary in the following sense. It didn't just present piecemeal counterexamples to this claim or that claim, but rather it was a systematic mathematical axiomatization of what they called of value theory, of the subjective counterpart of utility. And moreover, it was published by two psychologists in Econometrica, one of the leading journals in economics, and it was in fact the doorway through the work of these psychologists in particular and of other psychologists in general. That was the doorway into economics, what was the Nobel Prize, and since then even neuroscientists like Elisabetta Phelps do what you call a behavioral economics experiment. So Kahneman once said about prospect theory, which, as I said, got a Nobel Prize in economics, and which I'm not going to go into the details of, but he said about it, and you might be surprised, he said it's a theory about nothing. Now, what did he mean by saying it's a theory about nothing? When asked, he will say the following, which is true. He says, it's a theory about binary choice, meaning the need to choose just between two things, not more, which is often the case. Each option of which is a binary gamble. In other words, each of which has only two possible outcomes, unlike many things in the real world that have many possible outcomes, which are monetary. Lots of things in the real world are between things like lives and time and quality of life. Monetary with known probabilities. And then he says, now how broad is that? So by nothing he means it's a theory about a very, very narrow kind of choice. So it's not prospect theory that is important. It's some of the insights in prospect theory that go way beyond binary choice between binary gambles with monetary outcomes and known probabilities. And the ideas, the core ideas are, people are sensitive not to final positions. They are sensitive to changes in final positions, just like in psychophysics. This is true for perceptions of weight, luminosity, duration, lots of physical variables. Their subjective psychological counterpart is sensitive to changes in position, not final position. Changes are with respect to a reference point. The reference point could be set from outside. The reference point can be where you presently are, that you have been sitting here for enough time that you are now adjusted to the temperature in this room, the luminosity in this room. This may be your reference point. Changes from a reference point you are more sensitive to changes for the worse, called loss aversion, than to changes for the better, gains. And in my mind, in a sense, most critically, you're sensitive to frames. So this is way beyond the nothingness of prospect theory. Now, prospect theory only addressed the von Neumann Morgenstern theory of choice under uncertainty. Of course, economics deals with lots of other things, and so does psychology. And I will mention two of them just to give you headlines, not that I can go into them, but two really important things that economists need to deal with and figure majorly in behavioral economics are weakness of the will, otherwise known as self-control problems. In other words, we may know what our preferences are. We may wish to maximize something. We may wish to choose A, and lo and behold, we end up doing B. Why? Because we're human. I mean, this happened to Adam in the Garden of Eden, and it accompanies humankind ever since. And the other one, the other major problem is noise, a technical term which means no more and no less than inconsistency, and which Kahneman recently published with two colleagues, Oliver Siboni and Cass Sunstein, a book about called Noise. And noise, says Kahneman, he says, I assume responsibility for the fact that error in judgment is so closely identified with biases when a much greater source of errors in judgment is simply inconsistency or noise. So these are, again, two psychological facts that any economist who wants to not just do mathematical models, but actually make economic predictions must take account of. Now, how much time do I have left? Do I have time to address nudge, or should I go to my conclusion, which I can do now? So can I have a few more minutes, Viviana? Then I will say a word about nudge. So one of Thaler's best-known contributions to behavioral economics is the idea of nudges. What are nudges? Nudges are very small interventions in choice architecture, in a minute I'll say what that is, that may have far-reaching consequences. What is choice architecture? Choice architecture is the context in which choice takes place. If it's an experiment, then choice architecture is the words that the experimenter uses in presenting the problems. In the real world, it's where are you, what is going on when choice is being made, and nudges is another important word in what I said is that nudges may have far-reaching consequences. It's become very commonplace to think, since nudge came into being, that there is a simple, painless, costless intervention to cure just about everything. I was called many times in 2020 and 2021, I was called by the media as an expert behavioral economist, which, if you recall, I said in the beginning, I am not, if I could solve the problem of reluctance to be vaccinated. Is there a behavioral economic cure for it? Is there some small little intervention we can do, and lo and behold, all the people resistant to vaccinations will come and get them? Well, nudges work when they work. Unfortunately, in the real world, it is true that there is a positive correlation between cost and benefit, and if you want to have large effects, you often have to put large investments into it. But how wonderful it is that this is not always the case, that there are, in fact, cases, and their book is full of them, where small interventions can have far-reaching effects. Perhaps some of you have heard the embarrassing story of reducing insurance fraud by getting the person making the insurance claim to sign to the fact that everything written in the claim is true, not at the end of the claim, but at the beginning of the claim. Sadly, it turns out not to work, not to be effective, although many, many insurance companies adopted this idea because it's costless to adopt. But had it worked, imagine how nice it is if you can reduce insurance fraud just by moving the place on the form where you sign and say, everything I said here is true. So there have been very nice achievements with the idea of nudge. On the other hand, it's given many people a misconception of what behavioral economics is about and what it can do. Now, I'm going to conclude my talk and go back to the little clip I showed you at the beginning. This little clip, I summarized it for you, but now I'm going to add something that's pertinent to my point. The law that says that free fall is independent of mass is true in a vacuum. And on a clear day when there's no wind and you drop 2 balls from the Tower of Pisa, air resistance is close to what it would be in a vacuum, especially if the 2 balls are of equal shape. The intuition that guided Aristotle and everybody after him for 2,000 years was something like, what if you drop a feather from the Tower of Pisa or a piece of paper from the Tower of Pisa, and then we don't have to run the experiment. We can do the thought experiment. It won't reach the ground at the same speed as a metal ball. But that's air resistance. That's not free fall. So in the real world, there is friction. In the real world, if you want to push a heavy object a large distance, you will need to invest more effort if the object is heavy than light, and if you want to push it a long distance than short. But in a frictionless world, you can give a ball a little shove, and it will go forever and ever. That's inertia, because what stops it is friction, and I just said frictionless world. We don't live in such a world. But we can, and behavioral economics sometimes attempts to do that, we can sort of reduce friction. So one way of pushing a heavy ball a long distance is by smoothing the surface rather than by investing more effort in doing so. So my conclusion is I would like to point out that of all the various ways that people have tried to reconcile behavioral economics with mainstream economics, my personal preference is to consider the relationship between them the same as the relationship with physics in a world with friction and physics in a frictionless world. So are they competing with each other? Not really. Do they need to be reconciled with each other? Not really. One should just realize that high school physics pertains to a different world than the world we live in. The world we live in has friction in it. If you want to send rockets to the moon, if you want a car to run, if you want machines to run, if you want anything to happen in the real world, you better take account of friction, even though you shouldn't forget high school physics. Likewise, I would say the difference between mainstream economics and behavioral economics is not that they are competing with each other. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. Neoclassical economics is about that hypothetical creature called Homo economicus, which Dick Saylor calls econ, a fully rational being. And behavioral economics is about Homo sapiens, which is the kind of homo that we all are, and subject to all the effects I mentioned. I will repeat them: weakness of the will, inconsistencies, overconfidence, heuristics and biases, to mention just a few of the things. So they are different theories that pertain to different homo, and they are not necessarily in competition. You want to do economics in the real world with predictions, you better use behavioral economics. You want to do beautiful normative theory with elegant mathematical models, you can't beat neoclassical economics for that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like that the word homo would be changed into uomo with a W at the beginning. But aside from this, I was wondering about your nuggets. If in that sentence and the top of the questionnaire, it was written, if you lie, you lose your insurance, how much that would change what you are writing? So if it is only put at the beginning, the same sentence, it might not change a lot. But if you put a loss, like you're losing your insurance, probably people would be, and I'm going back to what also Elisabetta was saying, the fear of loss, that might induce people to be more honest. Do you agree?
So here is my answer. My answer is, if you want to know the answer, run a study. So you gave a reason why one might hypothesize it. It might sound to an economist like a crazy idea, because everybody knows that if you lie to your insurance company and they catch you, you forfeit the insurance. So why would an economist might say, why would writing it down matter? And you would say, because of everything we know about psychology. And I would say, you're absolutely right. Let's run a study. We won't know the answer unless we study it.
Okay. Is there any other questions? No? So thank you very much. And now it's the turn of Elisabetta Sirgiovanni, who is a young Italian philosopher, and she also studies economy and philosophy and history of medicine. Elisabetta works in the Department of Molecular Medicine, Museum History of Medicine at the Sapienza University in Rome. And she will talk about self-control, emotions, and morality, which are subjects that were touched already in the previous presentations. So Elisabetta, the podium is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Viviana. Thank you, the local organizers, which were great. And thank you all. I'm truly honored to be here in a panel with such big names. I can tell you that. I really admire the work of the people that came before me, so I needed to say that. So I work in a field called theoretical neuroethics, so at the intersection between ethics and neuroscience. I'm a philosopher, so I don't do empirical research, but I review the findings on the neural basis of moral behavior to understand if we may reconceptualize our moral theories, if and how we can do that. So there is a lot of interpretation around the results in neuroscience. So let me start. So let me start with a dilemma that everyone maybe knows. If you want an example that is related to economic and corporate, maximizing utility as profit, for example, in corporate culture, has been a sort of a basic premise of this kind of culture. But what if and when you have to sacrifice your customers, your clients, your investors, your stakeholders? And here we get to dilemma that we call, well, it has been called, this kind of dilemmas have been called the fruit flies of the social neuroscience. That is exactly like those little tiny insects that geneticists use experimentally. So they are really the basics of social neuroscience. So this is the trolley dilemma. And the majority of people would say in this version that we call the bystander, so would say that they would actually switch the lever to save one person instead of making this train hit and kill this 5 person entrapped on the rails. So the majority of people would respond yes, 85%, would basically give what we call an utilitarian response, maximizing consequences and utility. So this is why you see Bentham and Mill there. But if I ask you another kind of dilemma, and this is called the footbridge, and I ask you, would you maybe, yes, sorry. Would you maybe, so there is a very heavy guy who is passing by on a footbridge. You are on this footbridge. Would you maybe push this heavy man out from the footbridge to save the 5 people entrapped on the rails? And the majority of people say no. They would respond, we say, like a Kantian, because they would not use this person merely as a means. That was the Kantian maxim. So the reaction to the second dilemma is basically this, very emotional. So there is a very famous model that has been introduced by Joshua Green to justify, to say how we should respond to this model. So it's not just a descriptive model. He contributed a lot to understand what are the areas that are involved in this kind of judgments. But it's also, it purported a normative conclusion, so that we should be always utilitarian. So in the footbridge, we should answer yes. And his response depends on the fact that he actually says that in there are 2 routes to get to this conclusion. When you get to the non-utilitarian choice, you basically activate your emotion. It's an emotional route. So these are the areas that are involved. Amygdala, you heard about before. It activates. Then you have, the conflict, anterior cingulate cortex, that is always activated. Then from amygdala, you go to the intermediate prefrontal cortex, another emotional area. But the reason why Joshua Green thinks that we should be always utilitarians is that so we should say yes to the footbridge. Is it because basically the footbridge follow what he calls a rational route? So you have the activation of an area in particular, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's this area here, and some others, like inferior parietal lobe, and that it's basically considered to be the center of cognitive control. So we should control, we should be rational and utilitarian. So I think that this model actually hides sort of 3, what I call the 3 myths of self-control, 3 stereotypes that are really traditionally rooted. And these myths are the fact that self-control is rational, the fact that self-control is unconscious, and the fact that self-control is moral, and intending moral as radically utilitarian. And I'll tell you what I mean for radically utilitarian, but if you want to know it before, is instrumentally, to cause instrumental harm. So I won't speak about conscious stuff today, but I will focus on rationality and morality. So the most important thing is that I think that this model historically represents very well what we call the Victorian picture of the mind, brain, and morality. So the Victorian era is an era named after a woman that, Queen Victoria, 63 years of reign. But despite being an era named after a woman, it was an era of man intellectuals. And the kind of values that these intellectuals were spreading were actually values about rationality, self-empowerment, hard work, profit, masculinity, and those people are very, very influential people. So one is John Huggins Jackson, a very important, the founder of British neurology, Victorian neurology. I will tell you about in a minute about brain architecture. We have a model of consciousness. Self-control is about consciousness. We have popular books like Self-Help by Samuel Smiles for self-empowerment and social climb, and we have the 2 utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, who is chronologically a little before, and John Stuart Mill. So self-control is a Victorian term and corresponds to willpower. So the idea we have to exercise this capacity of rationality against akrasia, what Aristotle called akrasia, so the weakness of will. And we have to suppress our emotion for that. So let me also say that I said masculinity, but we have to remind that John Stuart Mill, an utilitarian, was actually in favor of, he was a defender of a universal suffrage, and he actually put the basis of the feminist movement in the liberal thinking. So things are a bit more complicated than that. But let me go to, so John Hageling's Jackson, despite being very famous for epilepsy, was the first to depict this idea of the brain as hierarchical. So this architecture is the idea that we have lower structure of the brain, which actually corresponds to lower functions, and higher structures of the brain structurally that corresponds to higher functions. So we have the behavioral and physiological responses in the lower structure, the brainstem. We have the limbic and paralimbic system, so middle emotions, here orange, and then we have the neocortex, the higher structure. This kind of view was also very much influenced by evolution. So the idea is that since the higher, it's very, very modern, so since the higher structures are the ones that are the most recent, evolutionarily speaking, they are the best. So they produce the best thinking, okay? So self-control is a Victorian term, but we have it in antiquity. It's just we have it named in another way. So Plato used to speak about temperance, or sophrosine in Greek. And here you have also an allegory used much, which is the charioteer allegory. The charioteer of Delphi you can see in the museum here. So the self, which is the charioteer, is controlling two horses. One is rationality, one is emotion. Okay, so, and you can also see that temperance is one cardinal virtue. So self-control was moralized from antiquity. And this means that it's exactly what we do now. So when we say that inability to diet, cheating on your partner, procrastinating at work are irresponsible behavior. And we also think that disorders of self-control corresponds to diminished or lack of responsibility. So we always moralize self-control. So what is self-control? Self-control is considered to have two components. So one is inhibition. You inhibit an automatic, you suppress an automatic and tempting response in order to delay gratification and get a better response at time two. So the emotions are involved in the first phase. As I said, you heard about the striatum before, the intermediate prefrontal cortex. Then you apply your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so you may delay gratification. And sometimes also a social cognition area is involved as well, which is tempoparietal junction. But basically, this is a top-down model, okay? So you go from rationality and suppress what is happening in the emotional area. So the hot and the cool system, okay? So the striatum is the hot. The cool system is in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we have various tests to measure and assess self-control. And for example, to assess inhibition, we have a famous test. There are many, many. But a famous test is a test in which is this test in which you don't have to read the words you see, which is a word naming color, but you have to name the color you see. It takes time. It's called Stroop test, and it's a test of inhibition. Then for the delay of gratification, we have a paradigm from the 1960s introduced by Michel at Stanford. So these are children that are left in front of a marshmallow for an incredible time for them, 15, 20 minutes, with the promise they will get 2 marshmallows if they wait and don't eat the marshmallow. So they have to resist and delay gratification. So these are measures that are used for self-control. And interestingly, so these measures, so the inhibition measures and the delay measures sometimes do not converge very well. So they are very, very heterogeneous. So we need to understand how they interact. So there are twin studies that say that self-control is heritable at 60%, but we still have that 40%. So environmental factors count a lot. So parenting, social models, and in general, I mean, I won't speak about predictions because they are not relevant here, but let me say that those kind of tests, like the marshmallow test, gave us a lot of empirical evidence about the strategies that also children use to exercise their self-control. So if we look at domains, so self-control is very domain-specific also in the same individual. Like, for example, you may be good at working, but not at dieting, and so on. But if you look, so the thickness of the layers identify how much desire people in general have on specific domains, and you immediately see, so the blue is food, eating, then we have sleeping, then we have sex, social contracts. So these are domains in which people really struggle for their self-control because they are basic needs. So why I think self-control is emotional? Well, there is literature, especially in psychology and neuroscience, is converging on the fact that very good delayers of gratification, so people who are very good in their self-control, they actually do not use willpower that much, because willpower is really a very short-term capacity, so it may fail very easily. So what they do, they basically find strategies to regulate their emotions. For example, sometimes they are not even so much tempted by the responses, or they put themselves automatically, or maybe they learn strategies like this in situations in which they do not even have to exercise their willpower. So this is a study that was published some years ago, and it's based on the reframing effect. So reframing effect is very famous because we know that if you ask someone in a hidden zero format, he will have difficulties in delaying gratification. So if you say, would you prefer $5 today or 10 in a month, maybe he might be puzzled about how to respond and would go with the $5 today. But if you do an explicit zero format, would you prefer $5 today or 0 in a month, or 0 today and 10 in a month, people might understand better the question and respond that they would delay the reward. So they would get the $10 in a month. But interestingly, the studies show that there is no difference in the action of willpower. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is considered to be a willpower area, was activating exactly in the same way in the two formats. But what was different was the striatum. So in one case, the salience of the immediate reward was less. So they could understand how to respond, but no willpower here. Again, these are the strategies that usually people work. I mean, it's not that I'm saying that they don't use cognition. They use sometimes cognition like to reappraisal their emotional response modulation. So, for example, you want to work, you think about funny things about your work, you perceive your work as fun, and then you have an emotional response. You put yourself in a situation selection. You go to your office, you don't go somewhere else, you don't go to the bar. You turn your phone off, you don't look at social media, you look at your PC. That is attentional deployment. So this is the fact that temptation inhibiting is very efficient, when we compare this kind of strategy to a willpower strategy, is also true of studies that have been done from the 70s. This is a very famous old studies in which the children were asked to do a very tedious task like copying something, okay? And they were said that actually at some point a distractor would come, Mr. Clown, but they shouldn't have played with Mr. Clown, because if they would have continued doing their task, they would have got a lot of toys in the end. But they gave them strategies to react to this kind of situation. And when they actually had the strategies, I have to do my work. So the willpower strategies, they couldn't resist. But when they were said, for example, that they had to inhibit temptation, like I won't watch Mr. Clown, or they would have to think about the reward, I'll have the new toys, things were going much better. So again, with emotions, we can do a lot of things. There are a lot of studies that actually try to influence our delay of gratification. So they try especially to intervene of our intertemporal discounting, the bias we have on the fact that we prefer to have a reward now instead of waiting, so we discount the later reward. So if you put people in front of very nice videos like these baby little dogs, so they will actually they would behave much better in intertemporal discounting. So they might delay gratification better. This is a study in which this was done, for example, and the subjects were supposed to choose between a reward today of $25 or every 6 weeks they could get $30, $35, $40, $45, $50. The interesting thing to notice is that the positive affect helped them to delay gratification when the difference between the sooner reward and the larger reward was sufficient. Like, for example, they said no when they were getting only 30, but they started saying yes when it was 35, 40, and so on. So they need a little bit of difference between the rewards. And trust is very important. So if you ask people if they would invest between $40 now or $65 in 7 days, but the people, so the face they see is an angry face, a neutral face, and a happy face, you may deduce they would choose the larger and later reviews with an happy face, because they perceive this face as much more trustworthy. So trustworthiness is very, very important to delay gratification. And you can do that with children, because only touching the children or caressing them before the task may help them delay gratification. So let me go very quickly to the morality. So I said before that self-control is very moralized, and the kind of views we have is that so what comes from the slow, controlled, and cognitive is good in moral terms, and what comes from fast, intuitive, and emotional is bad. But I think we should, reconceptualize this and try to understand exactly if maybe also the opposite might be the case. So, for example, this is a very, very recent study that showed that actually honest people, they use a lot of emotions when behaving honestly, but they need also rational areas when they are asked to behave dishonestly. So if you are dispositionally honest, you may need this area, which is the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is connected to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it's an area related to inhibition, to behave in a dishonest way. So it's true that maybe, like it's shown here, dishonest people use rationality, let's call, or inhibition to behave honestly, but honest people use rationality to behave dishonestly. So self-control in this case is not moral at all. If we intend it like that. Also, the link between dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and utilitarianism can be questioned. I mean, there is a lot of debate about that. There are studies about brain stimulation, so there is debate because the sample with brain stimulation is very, very little every time. But these findings, for example, the first findings were replicated recently. So if you disrupt the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so you interrupt this kind of activity, you would have expected to have actually less utilitarian responses, but then you get higher, so we don't know why. But if you enhance dorsolateral prefrontal cortex by another technique, the first is transcranial magnetic stimulation, the second is a direct current stimulation. So if you enhance it, you would expect a higher utilitarian response, and then you get lower utilitarian responses. So we need to justify this, because Joshua Green's model, for example, does not predict this kind of results. Another counter-evidence are psychopaths. So psychopaths are those kind of irresponsible, antisocial, but charming, Machiavellian, no empathy, no lack of response people, like serial killers, for example. We know and we identify a series of areas in which they have troubles, like, for example, amygdala again, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but very strangely, psychopaths are incredibly utilitarian. So they behave, this is actually a study on subclinical psychopaths, non-clinical psychopaths, but there are studies also on offenders. And they have an increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we wouldn't take psychopaths as a normative model for our societies. And that's basically a counter-evidence to Joshua Green model again. But again, I think we need to define what utilitarianism is, and there are many very interesting studies made by some scientists and philosophers in Oxford, like Guy Kane, for example, that they are proposing the idea that merely identifying utilitarianism with instrumental harm, using other merely as means, is not really depicting genuinely what utilitarianism is in morality, how it was conceived in morality. And the real goal of utilitarianism was impartial beneficence. So they conceived a scale, for example, to distinguish these two things, like, for example, people were responding to, would you admit political oppression for a short time to ensure the overall well-being, or would you keep money that you don't really need and donate it to charity causes? So psychopaths respond yes to the second, but not to the first. So you need a different kind of morality. You need impartial beneficence to be genuinely utilitarian, which is very different from the definition that Joshua Green gave. Let me also say, and I will conclude with this, we need to understand, I think, in this kind of debate, why we have this harm reactive aversion. So why we have this emotion in case there is instrumental harm towards other people, we still don't know. So some psychologists, very important, like evolutionary psychologists like Lida Kosmitz, John Tooby, I'm sure you know, they speculated that maybe evolution selected for this kind of reaction, emotional reaction, because they might be useful for our cooperation, our reciprocation, trust to other people. So we know that when that non-utilitarian people, so people who give non-utilitarian responses, are much more chosen as romantic and business partners. And we don't like consequentialist agents, especially when they actually use the sacrifice, the instrumental harm, in a very manipulative way. So we don't like it's not always said like that, but it's especially when their motives are strategic, we don't like the consequentialist. So we have still to find an answer to that. Let me conclude that this is the model of self-control that is much used in neuroethics, so a top-down model. But I think we should work more on conceiving a model that is much more interactive between cognitive functions and emotions. I'm not denying the intervention of cognitive function. I'm basically thinking there might be a vehicle to facilitate emotional regulation. And this is why we need a better model, because this model might have different normative conclusions from the ones that you heard before. Thank you very much. So these are people who have advised me during this project, and I'm really thankful for listening to my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta. You know, I thought something when you were talking about the happy man on the, that you don't want to throw him down. But I think that has a lot to do with morality, because we are taught that killing is bad. So if 5 people die because the bus runs over them, we are not killing them. It happens. But if you push somebody, it's deliberate killing, and this is not allowed by our standards of morality. And I think this is why people would refuse to do it. It's like, when you kill a person who is very sick and he wants to die, but law doesn't allow it, and most people feel it's not right.
Yes, you're right. I mean, this was how the dilemma was conceived at first. So it was conceived in 1960s by Philippa Fort, who was using it to discuss euthanasia and abortion then. But I can tell you that I think that, there were many studies after that in psychology, neuroscience, and actually we cannot really, give a very net distinction between the two. So it's very, very difficult to understand what is the distinction between the two. For example, I find very interesting a response that was given by another author of the classical moral dilemmas debate, which is Judith Thompson, who actually wrote a lot about this, that actually in that case we are interfering with the state of affairs. So it might be that there's something there, like we think that their man could live, while in the other case, the other guy is still entrapped, that there might be the case that the train could go there somehow. So of course there is a lot of debate about that, because people contested that it's not familiarity, maybe it's not intentionality, because you have your intentions there in the two cases. It's very, very difficult to trace the distinction between the two, but we have to work on that.
It's very interesting, because they are making studies that self-controlled cars or trains will probably take the decision to save the people and kill the one person, while we would take the opposite decision because of our moral issues. But I think we have to leave, because there is another event coming. I thank very much my wonderful speakers. It was a most interesting session for me. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. And the next appointment for emotions is in Lisbon on May 21st. And in London on May 15. I'm jumping too fast. And it will be about emotions in love and all the different kinds of love. So for the people who are connecting with us online, that's the next appointment in London. Thank you very much.